Okay, good morning, everyone. So I'm sure you know that we were supposed to have a 2 days workshop on environmental policy, but no one consulted me about the dates. So instead, we decided, I was encouraged by David to have a webinar with our two distinguished speakers. One of them is already here in Israel, and hopefully tomorrow he will fly back through Larnaca. And Miranda luckily stayed in Germany. So we have two speakers, and it's a webinar on the transition to a low carbon society. The first speaker is a good friend who is Miranda Schreurs, and Miranda is the chair of climate and environmental policy at the Munich School of Politics and Public Policy at the Technical University of Munich. And both Miranda and Ale have been doing transition for at least, I would say, 3 decades or several decades. So they are well experienced in the literature and the transition topic. Just a few ground rules. So each speaker will have about, let's say, between 20 to 25 minutes, and then it will be followed by 10 minutes of Q&A. And then at the end, since it is a 90 minutes webinar, we are likely to have an additional 20-25 minutes for a wider discussion on the topic. If there is an alarm, we all take a break, we all take a cover, and when we can resume, when it is safe to resume, we will restart the webinar. So please be patient with us because it is likely that there will be interruptions during the webinar. So Miranda, thank you for agreeing and to give a webinar. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Itai, and hello to everyone. And I am really sorry that in the midst of what had planned to be a fun and exciting webinar in person, that circumstances are making it difficult to do that. But of course, I hope for all of your safety and a quick end to these conflicts. So I'm going to give you a talk today on energy and climate politics, focused on the transition, but one that is happening in a world that is geopolitically rather turbulent at the moment. And I think all of you know that better than any of us. And this work has me in a fairly important stage of my thinking because we are in the process actually of thinking about how multilateral institutions are fraying on the edges. And with shifting geopolitical forces globally, uh, big questions arise to how we work cooperatively globally on energy and climate politics, and of course, many other issue areas, when our understanding of how the post-World War II world functions is being thrown into question. So I am going to focus on three of the largest players globally, the United States, China, and Europe, with the United States receiving not as much attention in the talk as China and Europe, because I think what's going on in the United States, we have been all reading about so much. But it's clear that the United States under Donald Trump has been pursuing, both in term one and in term two, a politics that has weakened these global institutions, the multilateral institutions, in part through a focus on national priorities and as a degree of, or actually a strong focus on energy self-dependence. So, in the United States, I think we're seeing an increasingly strong shift back to where things were in the 1960s and 1970s, where the United States still had a ability to uh, feed its own economy with its own fossil fuel resources. And the United States is shifting back in this direction. It actually now is globally one of the largest producers and exporters of fossil fuels. And of course, the other component of that is the very strong US military and political might, where the United States is also seeking to spread its views on the world and its interests to other world regions. China, in the meantime, is expanding its influence, and it's doing this in part through its economic growth. Part of this is its focus on the growth of a renewable energy infrastructure. China is, of course, still also very dominantly dependent on coal, but its expansion of renewables has been remarkable in the last few years, and it now also is dominating many clean tech exports. And then we look at Europe, and it could also be, instead of just writing Europe here, that we write the middle states, the middle powers, who have been focused to some extent, greater or lesser, Europe quite a lot, on an energy transition in the direction of what's called the Green New Deal, with the focus really being on how to also gain more independence from dependencies on other world regions, and in this case, particularly Russia, with a focus on greening the economy and producing more of its inputs into that economy domestically. And of course, the carbon border adjustment mechanism has been happening as all of this is taking place. And in my talk today, I will give you several points of activity that may not have really hit your radar screen. They've all been happening in the last couple of days as this war has been going on. So I don't think you've maybe seen them in the news, but they're quite relevant to this talk. So just as a way of background, this is a graph of annual CO2 emissions. And I took the base year of 1990 and bring it up through today. And what you see, of course, is that prior to the year 2000, it was still Europe and the United States who were the largest CO2 emitters. China is now, although China's CO2 growth may be peaking already. There's some indication that the growth in CO2 emissions could peak well before 2030, the date that China has set to be the latest date for the peak. I think it may really have peaked already. The United States, you can see, has had its emissions declining since about 2005, but compared to 1990 levels, the decline has been relatively limited. In the case of the European Union, there has also been a decline from 1990 through 2024. That decline has Europe not quite on track to its 2030 targets of reducing its greenhouse gas emissions by 55% of its 1990 levels. But I'll get back to that in a minute. So that's the background, and then we'll move forward here. I mentioned that I wasn't going to speak too long about the developments in the United States because I think you've probably all heard them and followed them. Under Trump 1, the United States pulled the US out of the global climate agreement, the Paris Agreement. It did it a second time. One of the first actions of Donald Trump in Trump regime 2, where the United States decided to reject the Paris Agreement, saying it was unfair and bad for US interests. and has gone beyond that and pulled the United States out of a total of 66 international institutions. It's the Paris Agreement, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I think Alex might give us a little bit more about the implications of that in his talk. So the United States pulling out of the Paris Agreement was not really a shock, but the additional rejection of institutions that are central to global efforts to address climate change is something that went, I think, further than even many experts looking at U.S. developments had expected. So we really do see a retreat here on the part of the United States from key multilateral institutions and also multilateral norms. And this, of course, raises very important questions in terms of what this means for our future efforts at global cooperation. And if you look at the developments domestically, you can take a look in any of the department websites. I looked yesterday and took a screenshot. This is the screenshot from the U.S. Department of Energy's website, where Trump points out, or the department points out, that what the U.S. is doing is restoring prosperity, safety, and security. Interestingly, here it says for the United States and Venezuela. Maybe if we look in a couple of weeks, we might add a couple of other countries like Israel to this list here. And that's the view that's coming out very strongly from the Trump regime. Yesterday, not yesterday, 2 weeks ago, we also saw that something that had been talked about already went through. Trump revoked the endangerment finding in the Clean Air Act that had been introduced during the Obama regime, saying that greenhouse gases are a threat to public health. Carbon dioxide, methane were listed as gases that are dangerous to human health, and Trump has revoked that, meaning that not only in the international context, but also in the national context, it will become that much more difficult to pursue an energy transition focused on climate change, because it was in large part this endangerment finding that gave the US EPA a legal basis for its actions. So the Trump administration has really focused on weakening institutions that have promoted climate change. And of course, in his rhetoric, you've also seen a lot of discussion about, climate change, that's just a hoax that has been perpetrated by China, or climate change, that's bad science. These kinds of statements are pretty common. We can now shift briefly to China. And I would say that China is taking a very different perspective here. And I think it has tremendous global implications, because we have the two largest economies here following different paths on their thinking about climate change. But their thinking about climate change is much more than a question about the environment. It's also a question about what kind of economic development path do you follow. Xi Jinping is not the originator of the concept of ecological civilization, but he has embraced it very strongly in his over decade-long rule in China. And the concept of ecological civilization, it's still a fairly vaguely defined term, but you'll find it throughout many laws and statements coming from the top leadership. It's the idea that China will become a great civilization, a modern civilization, but one based on a harmonious relationship between the economy and the environment. which of course is a very different image than many of us have had for many years about China, where a co-author of mine, Elizabeth Economy, wrote a book called The River Runs Black 2 decades ago, and that was because of the really, really poor state of the environment. And she was pointing out how bad water quality was throughout the country. And of course, air quality was a problem. Climate change emissions, I showed you that graph at the beginning of the talk. Xi Jinping has taken climate change as an area of potential Chinese leadership, which of course is a little different than where China is in terms of its own greenhouse gas emissions. But in terms of where China is going with the development of clean energy technologies. And because of the pressure China has been getting internationally to reduce its own greenhouse gas emissions, it's been focused much more on its own emissions and reducing those emissions, and that already for the last 15 or 20 years. So Xi Jinping, in numerous occasions, has stated the importance of acting on climate change and has reacted very much to what the US administration has been doing. China, says Xi Jinping, will continue to adhere to multilateralism, basically saying that China rejects the Trump administration's approach. It aims to deepen international cooperation, technological innovation, and transformation. So, taking the climate change policies of China on the road into South cooperation. And you see the goals that have been introduced, peaking emissions before 2030, reducing emission intensity, achieving a 20% share of renewables in its energy mix. And just to give you an idea, Germany is at 19%, with goals to also reduce its economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions between 7 and 10% from its peak levels by 2035. It has expanded its wind and solar power tremendously already. And in its new nationally determined contributions, has set a target to increase that a further 6 times to 3,600 gigawatts. That's a huge number. Germany is below 100 gigawatts. So, I mean, it just gives you an idea of the enormity of what we're talking about here. And in this effort, it's also starting to really push new energy vehicles. So you see the electric vehicle transition that's going on. So part of China's politics of the last decades has been focused on domestic economy. But since about the last 15, 20 years, China has started to slowly introduce more of a foreign policy. And part of that foreign policy has been taking China's model of economic development into other world regions, especially into the neighborhood of South and Southeast Asia, but also increasingly into Africa. It's greening the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative got started with the development of basic infrastructure in South and Southeast Asia, building more roads, building railroads, building coal-fired power plants. Pushback, and now China is saying, okay, we're actually going to take our concept of ecological civilization and start to push that also globally. So if you see what's going on with Chinese exports today, there are huge efforts to build massive solar power plants and develop wind parks also in other world regions. So we see two really different things going on. China, on the one hand, taking climate change and the export of climate-related technologies global. At the same time, the United States is pulling back and rejecting a lot of the climate science. China, of course, is in a very strong position in doing this because China has the basic technological inputs that it needs for a clean tech dominance. It controls 70 to 80% of the world's rare earth mineral production. And that, of course, means that it also has potential to control supply chains. So something I'm thinking about but don't really know to what extent US politics may also be taking the direction it is for fear of a supply chain problem established should China use renewable energy inputs, not only for climate change, but also for political pressure in the way that Russia did with its gas vis-a-vis Europe. But this is clearly an issue of tremendous importance. And you see that China has overtaken the European Union in terms of the capacity of renewable energy that it has. Just in the last 3, 4 years, China has produced more new renewable energy capacity than the rest of the world combined year after year. So pretty remarkable shifts going on there. As I mentioned, China's dominance in clean air energy metals is very apparent. You can see that there are a few other world regions that have some capacity. Brazil is quite big here. India has some. Canada, which of course has its also concerns also about some of the bellicose comments coming from the United States about making Canada into the 51st state, or the US interests in Greenland. These are clearly tied to the capacity to have rare earth minerals, which, of course, are also important beyond climate change. They're important in the development of many technologies, also technologies that are important for military purposes. So Canada, for example, has now been talking very much with the European Union about establishing deals on rare earth minerals. But China clearly dominates here. So what does this mean for Europe? Well, back in 2019, when the world was still relatively quiet and stable, of course, we'd already had the first Trump administration. But the European Union had a lot of domestic pressure. Fridays for Future was big concerns about climate change from a scientific perspective. And Europe decided it wanted to be the first climate neutral continent and established a target of achieving net zero carbon neutrality by 2050. This is 2019. At this time, we also have the establishment of the concept of a European Green Deal, which is still developed on the idea of a growth economy, but one focused on the idea of a transition to a circular economy where you don't have one-way streams of production anymore, but you have circular production. You have a focus on climate neutrality to be achieved through more renewable energy, a transport transition from the conventional motor to the electric motor. Basically, taking the transition into all fields of the economy. But then 2022 happens, February 2022. We have the second major invasion from Russia into Ukraine, the first having been the 2014 Crimea invasion. And Russia finds itself in a very challenging position because it's so dependent on Russia. And Russia both threatens to turn off the gas to Europe, something it had done a couple of times in the past already. And where Europe started to question the idea of being so dependent, and new politics of energy began. So at the end of 2021, Europe was getting about 45% of its gas from Russia. That's now down to 12%. Um, Russia was also giving Europe much of its solid fuel, so basically coal and oil. And in all of these areas, Russia has more or less lost its market here in Europe through various policies and programs. Although I say that with a little bit of an important footnote, that actually we are still, to this day, paying Russia more for the small amount of gas that we are getting than we have been giving aid to the Ukraine. So financially, Russia has still been benefiting to the order of about 10 billion, no, 15 billion euros, sorry, in 2024, just from its gas imports or the European imports, continued imports of Russian gas. So I said, as the war is breaking out in the Middle East, the European Union on the 26th of January uh, adopted a new regulation which permanently ends imports of liquid natural gas and pipeline gas, respectively in 2026 and 2027 from Russia. And interestingly, here is that word permanently. It says there's no going back to Russian gas because of a history of continuous imports from Russia. Because of the Ukrainian situation, Europe has beefed up its plans for this energy transition. It revamped the European climate law and its policies for emission reductions in the interim through 2050, partly with a focus on more renewables and also on hydrogen. And the gas package is looking at gas imports from other world regions. So Europe has actually been pushed forward on its climate transition by the developments in Ukraine. It has meant that Europe now plans to reduce its CO2 emissions by 55% compared to the 1990 base year. And to further up that to 66 to 72%, somewhere in that interim, by 2035. But I'll mention here that inclusion of two targets is because of some states in the European Union that are still very dependent on Russia, primarily Hungary and Slovakia, are fighting back. They don't like this development. European Union is also concerned about its position as an energy exporter, a clean energy exporter. It sees the competition from China with both embrace. It's happy about it from a climate change perspective, but concerned about it from a energy competition perspective or an export competition perspective. So Europe is planning to triple its own renewable energy capacity by 2030 and to also focus more on the global dimension of that expansion. It notes that Europe remains the world's largest climate financer. So if you look at how Europe is doing on its transition, it has 44% of its electricity now from renewable generation, with an estimate that had increased to almost 50%, 47% 2024. I presume it must be around 50% today. Unfortunately, we usually have a 1.5 year time lag on the data, so it makes it a little hard to know exactly where we're at now. But you can see the very strong growth in renewables and the electricity production, although that shift is still not as fast as it needs to be. EU greenhouse gas emissions now also include international aviation, and we're also starting to include emissions from the marine transport sector, at least in the emissions trading system. So there's still a long ways to go to get to that 55% target by 2030 and zero by 2050. But the EU maintains a focus on climate change, although perhaps it's weakening a little bit now because of domestic concerns about a slowing economy. Almost done. The last slides here focus on the EU emissions trading system, which was launched already back in 2005. It is seen as a key component of Europe's efforts to reduce its emissions. The ETS is given some credit for the 47% drop in greenhouse gas emissions in the industrial and utility sectors. And the ETS is being expanded. It was first expanded to include aviation and now also includes maritime emissions. And in 2027, it will be extended to the buildings, road transport, and several other sectors that are currently not covered. Right now, about 40% of the economy is covered. Excuse me. And the expansion is intended to help achieve those 2030 and 2035 goals. Final slide. The carbon border adjustment mechanism. It has just been introduced. There was a lead time, so countries were given a chance to get used to the system without it actually being in operation. But as of 2026, this year, January, it is now in operation. And it basically means that if you are producing products outside of the European Union that have a carbon content that hasn't been taxed in your domestic economy, you will now have to pay for certificates that bring the price up to what the equivalent would have been had it been produced in Europe under whatever the price of the European emission trading system allowances are. So you see that simply explained here, a product that was produced with only a 10 euro carbon price equivalent in another region will have to pay an additional 80 euro fee on the allowances when it produces that product in outside and wants to sell it in the EU. So what does this all mean? Well, it all means that although climate change remains, I think, one of the most serious issues facing the planet, we are in a situation where we don't have international agreement on what needs to be done. We have the United States rejecting climate change. We have the US focusing very strongly on further potential for fossil fuels. And you might ask if the war in the Middle East right now doesn't have an element to do with that, especially Saudi Arabian support for what was going on or what is going on with Iran. You see China taking a very different perspective and focusing attention on a clean energy transition that also has a strong export dimension. China trying to win friends through a very different kind of policy than that is being pursued by the US right now. And Europe, I think, feeling like a middle power rather than a big power, sandwiched a little bit between these two large hegemonic players with a policy that is still trying to pursue climate change and the energy transition, but with growing concerns about what this means for its own economy, which is why this CBAM has been introduced. Which leads us to the big question of where does this all go? What does this mean for multilateral institutions and for our ability to establish global priorities and decisions about where our policies and politics need to go? I think we're moving into a new era, and that means there's going to be a lot of things that need more research and study. So thanks very much, and I'll stop here.
Thank you, Miranda. So let's take a few quick questions and answers. Who wants to go first? Eli, I can see your hand.
I was just clapping. I appreciated
Ah,
that. I
you're
wasn't
clapping.
pointing.
Okay. Ofer, you're also clapping. Okay. Who is not clapping or who is also wants to ask a question?
Uh, May?
Yeah, yeah, of course.
Um, Thanks for the presentation. I just have one maybe slightly different perspective about China. So people like pretend to picture China as the champion of climate protection, things like this. But if you look at the absolute numbers, we should not forget that China annually adds around, like in 24, it was around 80 gigawatts, and in 25 is around 100 gigawatts of coal capacity. That roughly means that China annually adds 1.5 total German electricity generation per year. So when you look at the relative numbers, yes, so coal generation can be going down. But in absolute numbers, China didn't abandon coal and is not going to abandon it. And we should not forget that solar panels, which we get from China and Europe and elsewhere, they produced using coal. This is just a comment on the question.
I can see another hand. Iran, please.
Thank you, Miranda. It's fascinating as usual. It seems you talked about three major players, but if I go back to your first slide, it seems there's an additional major player, which is India. And I was wondering if you can comment on what's going on there, because it seems it's exceeded even the EU in terms of emissions.
Sure, maybe I can respond to both of those statements and comments. On China, I of course recognize what you're saying, and that yes, China remains very dominantly dependent on coal and has been building coal-fired power plants both internationally and domestically. On the domestic front, what I understand is that many of those new coal-fired power plants are being built in order to phase out the more inefficient and older coal-fired power plants, and that many of them are actually more like a reserve capacity. They're not actually being used. So China has that capacity. It's not going to stop its economic production for lack of coal. So it's doing everything at the same time. It's building its fossil fuel capacity while also massively expanding its renewable capacity. But I think the intention to work towards carbon neutrality is quite strong in China. The date China has set for climate neutrality is a decade after the European Union, 2060. So that doesn't mean that China will completely abandon coal. It will start to see the potential for carbon capture, storage, utilization. Those are areas it's focusing attention on. It's also focusing attention on other energy forms, including both nuclear fission and fusion. The picture I portray here has not included whatever military intentions China might have in the long run. That remains an open question for me. But what you do see right now is a very different politics in terms of the attention being given to clean energy. And I think that matters a lot because of the question of where development in other parts of the world is going. And we're already seeing many, many countries that are turning from their focus on partnership with the US to focus on partnership with China. And that matters because China in the past was a country that didn't have alliances. And now it is building them, and it's building them through clean energy cooperation. So I think that's very significant and something we need to be aware of. As for India, India has also been putting a lot of attention into renewables. It's expanding its renewable energy capacity in a huge way. It has, of course, watched what's going on in China, learned from what's going on in China, but doesn't want to become very, very dependent on China. So India is also looking into how to develop its own rare earth capacities. Recycling technologies will be very big for India. India's per capita CO2 emissions are still very low. They're about 2 tons of carbon per person. US per capita are around 14 tons per person, and in Europe it's now around 7 tons of carbon per person. So India is growing in its emissions, but they're still relatively low. It doesn't mean that India's emissions aren't going to continue to grow, because India is a huge user of coal, and its economy is increasing by 5-6% per year. But India is still a small player on a per capita basis. It will get bigger.
Miranda, thank you. Now let's move to the second speaker, and then